The provided real story of historical system of peonage in post-Civil War Georgia, focusing on the case of landowner John S. Williams. It outlines a clear narrative arc, the economic backdrop, the deceptive recruitment, the brutal conditions of forced labor, Williams' growing paranoia as investigations closed in, his decision to murder 11 workers to silence them, the discovery of the bodies, and his eventual trial and conviction, the perpetuation of slavery under a new name, corruption within local law enforcement, the clash between a modernizing America and hidden barbarism, the desperation that leads to atrocity, and the fragile possibility of justice. The real story structured as an expository historical account, not as a narrative story. It tells rather than shows, stating facts and events without scene setting, character depth, dialogue, or emotional pacing. To regenerate this as an engaging, chapter-based story for a video format, we need to. The Georgia sun beat down on the dusty road leading out of Savannah, baking the hope right out of a man. Huck Morgan felt it leaching away with each mile, replaced by a gnawing doubt that curled in his stomach like a worm. The letter in his pocket, now soft and frayed at the edges from constant handling, felt less like a ticket and more like a prayer. To Huck Morgan. Steady work at Williams Farms, Jasper County. Good wages for strong men in timber. Room and board provided. Present this letter at the Mon train depot. It had come through his cousin's friend, a man who knew a recruiter. For Huck, born to freed parents who knew nothing but sharecropping and debt, the words good wages shone like a beacon. Head said a quiet goodbye to his mother, kissed her worried forehead, and walked away from the familiar cycle of poverty that stretched back to emancipation. He was 22, strong from years in the cotton rows, and ready to build something of his own. The Great War was over, and the world was supposed to be changing. The man at the Mon Depot was named Clyde. He wore a clean shirt and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Huck Morgan? Right on time. Mr. Williams values punctuality. He looked Huck up and down, assessing livestock. You'll do. Wagon's over here. The wagon carried 6 other men, all black, all with the same wary hope in their eyes. They jostled in silence as the wagon left the sparse town behind and plunged into a tunnel of dense pine and oak. The air grew cooler, thick with the scent of sap and damp earth. After 2 hours they turned onto a rutted private road, passing a wooden sign that read Williams Enterprises, Private Property. The farm wasn't a farm as Huck knew it. It was an empire carved from the wilderness. To one side, vast fields lay fallow. To the other, a buzzing sawmill sent plumes of steam into the sky. But it was the cluster of men near a large timber pile that caught Huck's eye. They moved slowly, rhythmically, loading logs onto a wagon. Their clothes were rags, and even from a distance, Huck saw the unnatural glint of iron around their ankles. His blood went cold. "What's them chains for?" he whispered to the man beside him, a tall, gaunt fellow named Elijah. Elijah just stared, his face hardening. "Ain't for decoration." The wagon stopped before a large white-painted farmhouse with a broad porch. A man stepped out. John S. Williams was not a large man, but he carried an aura of absolute authority. He was dressed in fine trousers and a vest, his hair neatly parted. He inspected them with a landlord's gaze. "Welcome," Williams said, his voice calm, almost pleasant. "You've come for honest work. I provide it. You'll be cutting timber for my mill. The pay is fair, but remember, you incur costs. Tools, your cabin, your food. It's all advanced against your wages. You work, you pay it down. It's a simple contract. A white overseer with a face like weathered leather, name of Dobbs, handed each man a paper and a stub of pencil. Make your mark at the bottom." Huck couldn't read. Well, but the paper looked official. The other men, eager not to cause trouble, pressed thumbs to ink and made their marks. Huck hesitated. "Sir, could you read out the terms?" Williams' pleasant expression froze for a second. Dobbs stepped closer. The terms are what the boss said. Tools, cabin, food. You want the work or not? Under Dobbs' gaze, Huck made his mark. It felt like signing away the sun. They were led not to a cabin, but to a long, low shack behind the mill. The door was heavy oak. Inside, the air was foul with the smell of unwashed bodies and despair. Straw pallets lined the dirt floor. There were no windows, only narrow slats near the roof. "Home sweet home," Dobbs said, slamming the door. A heavy bolt slid shut on the outside. In the gloom, Huck looked at the 11 other men in the shack. Their eyes were hollow, their spirits broken. One older man, whose name was Thomas, met Huck's gaze. "Contract." Thomas spat softly, nodding at the paper Huck still clutched. "Only contract here is the one between the chain and your leg. You just bought yourself a world of debt, son. A debt you ain't never gonna pay." That night, as Huck lay on the prickly straw listening to the snores and whimpers of men, he understood. The letter wasn't a ticket. It was a trap. The recruiter's smile was a snare. And the chains he saw weren't an anomaly, they were his future. He had walked into the smiling jaws of the past, and the jaws had snapped shut. Dawn came not with a rooster's crow, but with Dobbs' baton hammering against the shack door. "Up? You ain't paying off your debt sleeping." The work was timber. Massive virgin longleaf pine. Huck was paired with Elijah, handed a crosscut saw that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Their job was to fell the giants, limb them, and cut them into logs for the mill. For every hour of back-breaking labor, a new charge was mysteriously added to their invisible ledger. "You dulled that saw, Morgan," Dobbs would bark. "That's 50 cents off your wage. You took an extra cornbread at supper. That's a dime. We're on your cabin cot. Nickel a night." The numbers were called out arbitrarily, a relentless arithmetic of subjugation. Huck quickly realized the truth Thomas had hinted at. The wage was a fiction. The debt only grew. It was a prison with invisible walls, built on paper and enforced by the rifle Dobbs casually carried. The guards were other poor whites, their faces pinched with a meanness born of their own precarious lot. They took pleasure in their small authority, finding reasons to swing their batons. A log loaded too slowly. A moment of rest, leaned against a stump. One afternoon, a young man named Jesse, no more than 18, stumbled under the weight of a log. He fell and the log rolled, narrowly missing Dobbs' foot. "Clumsy fool," Dobbs roared. He didn't use the baton. He drew a leather whip from his belt. The crack echoed through the pine grove, a sound that silenced even the birds. Jess's cry was a sharp animal thing. 3 lashes split his shirt and the skin beneath. Huck stood frozen, the saw handle slick in his grip. He met Jess's tear-filled eyes and saw his own terror reflected. There was no mercy here. This wasn't just hard labor. It was a system designed to break you, body and spirit. The only respite was the nightly slop, a thin gruel of cornmeal, sometimes with a scrap of fatback, and the whispered conversations in the dark shack. Thomas, who had been there the longest, 2 years by his count, became their reluctant historian. "Peonage," he whispered one night. "That's the fancy word for it. Slavery by another name. Sheriff in Monticello gets a kickback for every vagrant he brings in. You was walking no job paper. That's you. You owe a fine you can't pay. That's you. They sell your debt to Williams. We ain't workers. We're inventory." "There is laws," Elijah insisted, his voice a low rumble. "Federal men. I heard in Atlanta." "Atlanta's a world away," Thomas cut him off. "These woods are their world. The law is Dobbs' rifle. The judge is John Williams' ledger." Huck thought of the world outside, of automobiles and telephones and the news of a modern America. It all seemed like a fairy tale here. In this shack that stank of despair, the real America was here, in the Georgia pines, where a man's life was measured in cents on a fraudulent balance sheet. His anger, once a hot coal, began to cool and harden into something else, a cold, clear determination. He watched the routines of the guards, the layout of the land, the flow of the river at the property's edge. The debt on paper he would never repay, but the debt they owed him for his freedom, his labor, his very humanity, that was a ledger he intended to settle. Escape wasn't a dream, it was a calculation. And Huck started doing the math. The system's fragility was revealed in small, terrifying ways. One morning, a federal revenue agent, lost on back roads, pulled his Model T up to the farmhouse asking for directions to Monticello. The entire camp froze. From the timberline, Huck watched as John Williams, all smiling hospitality, walked out to meet the man, pointing down the road. But his posture was rigid, his eyes darting toward the woods where his chained workforce labored. Dobbs and the other guards moved like specters among the men, hissing warnings. Head down, saw moving. One word, one look, and you'll feed the catfish in the Yellow River. For those tense 20 minutes, the true power dynamic flipped. The master was afraid. The sight was more intoxicating to Huck than water in the desert. The law, the real law, was a tangible force that could make a powerful man sweat. The agent left none the wiser, but the incident cracked Williams' facade of untouchable control. He became a visible presence on the worksite, his eyes missing nothing, his paranoia a new guard tower. Head pore over the ledgers with Dobbs, their conversations low and urgent. "Hes scared," Thomas muttered that night, a rare spark in his eyes. "Something's happening out there." I heard the guards talking. Newspapers in Atlanta are writing about missing Negroes. Families are asking questions. A new man arrived the next week, not as a laborer but in a suit. He was a county deputy, fat and sweating in his wool uniform. He and Williams spoke on the porch for a long time, drinking whiskey. Later, Williams' shouts echoed from the farmhouse. "I pay for discretion. You ensure the silence, or your share of the proceeds dries up." The deputy left, red-faced and angry. The tension tightened another notch. Hope, Huck learned, was a dangerous commodity in a place like this. It could get you killed as easily as rebellion. But the whispers of the outside world, carried on the wind with the sawdust, were irresistible. They spoke of a great migration, of black families boarding trains for Chicago, of veterans who had fought in France demanding rights at home. A world was moving on, and it was leaving places like Williams' Farms behind as a festering secret. This external pressure turned inward as a tightening vice. Punishments became more severe, more random. The men were pushed harder, fed less. Williams was squeezing every ounce of profit from them, as if sensing his time was limited. Huck's escape plan, nascent and fragile, began to solidify. He identified a spot along the Yellow River where the current was strong but the guard patrol was thinnest, just before dawn. He started hiding tiny scraps of hardtack in a hole in the shack wall. He shared his plan in the deepest dark of night, with only Elijah and Thomas. "The river leads to the Ocmulgee," Huck whispered, tracing a map in the dirt floor only they could feel. "Follow it far enough, we hit a town. We find a federal building, a post office, something. If we run, they hunt us down like dogs," Elijah said. "If we stay, we die here," Thomas countered grimly. "Or worse." "Worse?" Huck asked. Thomas was silent for a long moment. A man who's this scared, a man who sees his whole world about to collapse, he don't just let his property walk away. He disposes of it. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air settled over them. The calculus of risk had just changed. Staying no longer meant a life of slow degradation. It might mean no life at all. The decision was being made for them. They had to run, and soon. The world was closing in on John Williams, and Huck knew with a cold certainty that they could not be caught inside the walls of his fear when it finally shattered. The breaking point came 2 days later. A well-dressed black preacher from the NAACP, accompanied by a nervous white journalist from Savannah, drove up to the main gate. They didn't get past the porch. Williams met them with a shotgun held casually, not pointed but prominently displayed. Huck, hauling a log nearby, strained to hear. "We are inquiring after a member of my congregation, Lemuel Jones," the preacher said, his voice clear and brave. "His family has had no word." "I employ willing laborers," Williams replied, his voice like ice. "If they choose not to write home, that's not my concern. This is private property. You are trespassing." The journalist scribbled furiously, "Mr. Williams, there are allegations of peonage in this county. Could we see your employment records?" Williams' smile was a thin, cruel line. "My records are my business. Now get off my land before I have you arrested for trespass." They left, but the damage was done. The outside world had knocked on the door and looked John S. Williams in the eye. The veil was torn. That evening no supper came. The shack door was bolted extra early. The men sat in a silence thicker than the darkness. They could hear it, raised voices from the farmhouse, the sound of something breaking. Williams was unraveling. Near midnight the bolt slid back. Dobbs stood there, the silhouette of a devil in the doorway, flanked by two other guards with rifles. "Morgan, Elijah, Thomas, Jesse, on your feet." The voice held a finality that stopped the heart. Huck's legs wouldn't work. This was it. Not an escape, a culling. "Move!" Dobbs barked, yanking Huck up by his collar. They were marched out, not toward the fields, but toward the river. The night was clear and cold, the moon a sliver casting weak light on the rushing water of the yellow river. Waiting for them was John Williams himself. He held no weapon. He simply stood, hands behind his back, as if surveying a crop. "You represent a liability," he said, his voice eerily conversational. "The world is becoming inconveniently curious. I built this with my own hands. I will not see it destroyed by the tales of ingrates." Huck's mind screamed. This was the worst Thomas had feared. Not just killing, but eradication. The river would be their silent archive. "Please, Mr. Williams," Jesse sobbed, falling to his knees. "I won't tell nobody. I swear." Williams nodded to Dobbs. It happened with nightmarish speed. Dobbs clubbed Jesse behind the ear with his rifle butt. The boy crumpled. One of the other guards, his face a mask of grim duty, began fastening a heavy logging chain around Jess's ankles. He attached a large field rock to the links. Huck acted without thought. It was pure instinct, an animal lunge for survival. He shoved Elijah toward the dark tree line and screamed, "Run!" He didn't look to see if Thomas followed. He dove sideways into the cold, shocking embrace of the river as a rifle shot cracked the night. The water was chaos and salvation. The current grabbed him, pulling him under, tumbling him. He heard another shot, then shouting, "Get the others in the water! Now!" Muffled by the river in his ears, he fought for the surface, gasping for air, and let the current take him. He was a piece of driftwood, a shadow, shooting downstream in the ink-black water. He didn't know how long he swam and drifted. He finally dragged himself onto a muddy bank miles downstream, his body shaking with cold and terror. He was alone. The silence of the woods was absolute. He had no way of knowing if Elijah or Thomas had made it. He only knew the river behind him now carried the weight of innocent men, his friends, anchored to its muddy bed. He was free. But the cost of that freedom was a horror that would haunt him forever. He had to get to light, to people, to law. He had to make the river give up its terrible secret. He began to walk, following the North Star, a dripping, haunted prophet carrying a tale of murder in the Georgia night. For 3 days, Huck moved like a ghost through the pine barrens. He ate grubs and drank from streams, his clothes drying stiff and muddy on his body. The fear of Dobbs' posse hunting him was a constant itch between his shoulder blades, but a fiercer fire drove him, the need to testify. He stumbled upon a small church on the outskirts of a hamlet called Shady Dale. It was a humble black church, whitewashed and leaning. Exhausted and near collapse, he knocked on the door of the nearby parsonage. The preacher who answered was the same man who had come to Williams' gate, Reverend Ames. His eyes widened in recognition and shock. "Great God! You were there, inside by the fire." Huck's story poured out in ragged bursts. The false contract, the endless debt, the chains, the lash, the cold calculation in Williams' eyes by the river, the blow that felled Jesse, the chains, the rocks, the shots in the night. Reverend Ames listened, his face a storm of grief and fury. When Huck finished, the preacher placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "The river will not hold them, son. The truth always surfaces." Reverend Ames was a man of networks. He sent telegrams to the NAACP in Atlanta and to a reform-minded newspaper editor in Savannah. He also contacted a friend in the Federal Justice Department who had been quietly building cases against peonage. The machinery of justice, slow and rusted from disuse, began to creak into motion. It was a fisherman who found the first body 2 days later, snagged on a root in the Yellow River near the Ocmulgee Junction. The chain was still wrapped around its ankles. Then another was found, and another. The South, and soon the nation, erupted. Newspapers that had ignored the whispers of peonage now screamed with headlines. 11 bodies in Georgia River. Slavery's ghost claims victims in 1921. Landowner held in gruesome murders to hide peonage camp. The story was undeniable, visceral, horrifying. Photographs of the recovered chains and rocks were printed. The abstract crime of debt slavery had a concrete, drowned face. John S. Williams and his overseers were arrested. The trial was set for Newton County, moved from Jasper due to the feverish atmosphere. Huck, cleaned up and clothed by the NAACP, was the star witness. Walking into that packed, segregated courtroom was like walking into a lion's den. White spectators glared. Williams, now in a suit, stared at him with pure, undiluted hatred from the defense table. But Huck looked past him. He looked at the all-white jury, and he told his story. He spoke of the letter, the shack, the ledger that only grew, the taste of the gruel, the sound of the whip, and the cold, moonlit water of the Yellow River. He named Jesse, Thomas, Elijah. He described the rocks. The prosecutor entered the chains into evidence, dropping them on the courtroom floor with a sound that made everyone jump. Williams' defense argued that Huck and the others were thieves, that they'd drowned accidentally while fleeing. But the bodies, the chains, and Huck's raw, unwavering testimony were a tide too strong to stem. The jury was out for a day. When they returned, the foreman's voice was clear, guilty of murder. A gasp swept the room. A white landowner convicted of murdering black men to conceal a slavery operation. It was a seismic crack in the foundation of Jim Crow. John S. Williams was sentenced to life imprisonment at hard labor. As Huck left the courtroom, reporters surrounded him. "How do you feel, Mr. Morgan?" He looked past them, toward the distant, unseen river. "It don't bring them back," he said quietly. "But maybe it keeps the next man from going in." Justice, he thought, was a partial payment on an endless debt, but it was a start. Huck did not return to Jasper County. The NAACP helped him secure passage north as part of the Great Migration had only heard whispers about in the shack. He boarded a train at Savannah's ornate station, a free man in a suit, surrounded by other black faces filled with a similar blend of trauma and hope. As Georgia's red clay and endless pine forests gave way to the rolling hills of the Carolinas, then the dense cities of the north, Huck felt the physical chains fall away. But the other chains, the memory of Jess's cry, Thomas' grim wisdom, the sound of that rock splashing into the dark water, those traveled with him. He settled in Chicago, found work in a stockyard, and joined a church. He married a kind woman named Clara, a schoolteacher whose parents had also fled the South. They had children, He built a life, a small, hard-won fortress of normalcy against the past. But some nights the river came to him in his dreams. Head wake up gasping, the taste of muddy water in his mouth, the ghost weight of chains on his ankles. On those nights, he'd sit by the window of their small apartment, watching the electric lights of the city, and think of the dark Georgia woods. He followed the news. Williams' conviction did not end peonage. The system was too entrenched, too profitable, but it pulled it, screaming, into the light. It became harder to hide. The case was cited in congressional reports. It empowered other victims to speak. It was a scar on the conscience of a nation that preferred to believe slavery was a finished chapter. Years later, in 1941, Huck read in the Chicago Defender that John S. Williams had died in prison. He felt no triumph, only a hollow closure. The man was gone, but the tree of hatred and greed he'd watered was still alive. When his son, named Thomas after his lost friend, asked about the South, about where we come from, Huck did not speak of pastoral beauty or simple living. He took a deep breath, and he told him about a letter that was a trap, a ledger that was a lie, and a river that refused to keep a secret. He told him that freedom was a fragile flame, and that some men will always try to snuff it out for profit. The chains you can see are easy to break, Huck told his wide-eyed boy. It's the chains you can't see, the ones made of fear, of lies, of thinking one man is less than another. Those are the heavy ones. Those are the chains you gotta watch for your whole life. He looked out the window at the bustling, segregated city. The fight had just changed its address. The shadow of the Georgia pine was long, stretching even into this northern light. But he was here. He had testified. He had survived. And in the act of remembering and telling, he was chipping away at the debt not just his, but the nation's. The river had given up its dead, and Huck would never let the world forget what the water had revealed. If this story of hidden history and the fight for justice moved you, please share this video to keep these crucial memories alive. Subscribe to Tales of Slavery for more real stories that history books often overlook. We owe it to the remembered and the forgotten to bear witness.